reminds me of something else. There's a clip of Mr. Beast where he's basically saying that if his goal or something like that was happiness, he would not be doing the YouTube videos he's doing. Now that's someone who's extremely wealthy and rich. And if that's an extreme example of someone who is pursuing a completely different end goal, which is money at the expense of his own happiness. Elon Musk is another good example. I don't think that guy was trying to pursue happiness. He was trying to pursue an achievement. Tesla. That was his end goal. Not happiness, brother. That guy was not sleeping like barely like 2 hours a day or something like that. There's no way he was pursuing his own happiness. Could have just settled down on a normal shop, lived a content life, decided though that he was going to save his business even at the expense of his soul. Or just take the disbelievers in the Quran. Like someone might say, oh, they were pursuing their but really, like imagine a clear proof and miracle comes for you that this is from God, something is from God, and that what you're doing is going to lead you to suffer forever in hell, and then you decide that you're going to pursue what your forefathers were upon because that's easier, or because that's your forefathers. That's it. Like that's one of the two reasons. Either it's because it's easier to stay the way I am, even if what would lead to my happiness is something radically different. Or it could be that I am not going to, quote unquote, betray my forefathers, even if it leads to my suffering. Like it's quite diverse, the types of end goals humans tend to have. Anyway, also, if people believe in paradise and hell, they could hold a non-utilitarian based notion of justice for the sake of gaining the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people in the next life. And this would contradict me in two ways. Firstly, that to get to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, that justice itself has to be utilitarianistic in nature. But if it's something like Islam, which is irreconcilably different from utilitarianism, but results in the majority of people gaining eternal happiness, Mill's proof is then falsified because it contradicts what justice actually is and ironically leads people to hell and causes a reverse utilitarianistic outcome, which is that the majority of people suffer eternally, and that being due to a fabricated notion of justice that people practiced on earth, which was utilitarian in its nature but wasn't correct. Your argument raised an important and sophisticated critique of Mill's utilitarianism, especially in the context of religious beliefs that prioritize the afterlife over the immediate pursuit of happiness in this world. Let's break down your critique. Justice and the afterlife in religious frameworks. You propose that a belief in paradise and hell can lead to a non-utilitarian conception of justice, where people act justly, not necessarily for the sake of maximizing happiness in the present world, but in pursuit of eternal happiness in the next life. In this view, justice might involve practices or moral principles that seem quote-unquote unpleasant or harsh by utilitarian standards, but are aimed at ensuring the greatest happiness in the afterlife, based on a divine order or moral law that transcends human reason. I don't think even the Sharia is transcending human reason. I think actually a lot of the non-secular rules of the Sharia, you could perfectly understand the reason, but the reason is irreconcilable with what a liberal or utilitarianistic person thinks is a good reason. Like, for example, you could perfectly understand racism and why racists do what they do. You could you can figure out the reasons, and you can figure out their racist laws, why is it the way it is, but that what they are claiming makes a good rule, a good moral rule. What reasons make a good moral rule? You are disagreeing with that on a deep level with your own beliefs about what makes a good reason good. Like, does that make sense? Like I can understand exactly why racists, Nazis, communists, pagans believe what they believe about justice. I can understand the rules and the reasons they have behind those rules, but I completely reject the rules and the reasons. It's the same way with a secular liberal with regards to Islam. You can at best get him to understand what are the reasons behind rulings, but he's not going to agree with that. He was not raised to think, for example, that something can be wrong even when it harms no one, even when it's consensual. Or that something can be wrong because it's an imitation of God in the act of creation, or something is wrong because it gives the right of God of being exclusively worshipped to an idol. He can understand it bare minimum in his imagination, but his heart ain't gonna agree with it, because his heart is corrupted by his upbringing, just like a racist's heart or a Nazi's heart or a communist heart or a pagan's heart. All of their hearts are corrupted by how they're brought up. As the Prophet ﷺ said, every person is born upon a sort of natural, original set of beliefs or nature, a natural nature. But his parents make them into a Jew, a Christian, Zoroastrian. And an extension to that is a secularist, or a communist, or a Nazi, or a whatever ideology. Each group is raised a particular way, generally speaking. Sometimes they are not just raised that way, or sometimes they were raised in a completely different belief system, but then they change it. Although that's more rare. But most secularists nowadays, they're just kind of raised with secular media, movie, society, and institutions, and that's why they are secular. Not because of a deep reasoning, but that also wouldn't really matter. Because there are people who, for example, were perfectly normal in a secularist eyes, but became like ISIS or something like that. Like you could take some people who are surprisingly raised secular, like secular apostates, and some of them went to join ISIS or something like that, or some of them went and became Nazis or left-wing or racist. They if you really think that, because you were not raised secular and then you think yourself into secularism, then now secularism is correct. Well, then guess what? A person like an ISIS member could argue identically, because a lot of these guys were originally pure secularists. Them actually choosing to sacrifice their secular beliefs because they thought it was irrational for the sake of what God has told them, as they believe it, is something that is called a reasoning process still, even if you disagree with the reasoning process. Same with those people who became Nazis, who were originally raised secular, or who became racist after originally being secular in their upbringing. All of these guys go through a reasoning process. It's not that it's valid, there's incorrect reasoning things happening, but I'm just saying, you can't just claim, because I went through a reasoning process, therefore secular is correct. Then all these ideologies are correct. Because if you think about it universally, every ideology that has ever existed was invented by someone. Either you're a follower, like you're blind following, or that ideology, you are like the first inventor of it. Because all these ideologies began at some point in time. That means somebody thought it up. Racism, Nazism, communism, paganism, liberalism, secularism, feminism, all of them. So then if that's the case, are you going to say, because they thought it up, they reasoned, therefore it's correct? Of course not. Otherwise, all these ideologies are correct at the same time, which is impossible. They're all contradicting each other. So, I went for a while there. What was I saying? For instance, in Islam, certain actions and behaviors are seen as essential for salvation and entering paradise, while disobedience to God's commands might lead to punishment and hell. This framework does not follow the utilitarian logic of maximizing happiness here and now, but instead it follows a divine and eternal justice that ensures the ultimate happiness in the afterlife. This could mean that what is perceived as unjust in the short term, severe punishment or restrictions in this life, might be seen as just and morally necessary in a larger eternal context, contradiction with Mill's definition of justice. Mill's utilitarianism holds that justice must be aligned with the principle of utility, i.e. actions that promote happiness or minimize suffering are just, and actions that do not lead to the greatest happiness are unjust. However, in religious systems like Islam, the idea of justice is not necessarily tied to the maximization of worldly happiness. It might involve hardship, moral discipline, or even punitive actions that do not immediately maximize pleasure or minimize suffering, but are seen as leading to eternal happiness in the afterlife. Here you argue that Mill's concept of justice is incompatible with religious systems that promote actions that might appear unjust in the short term but are, according to the belief system, just in the long term because they lead to eternal happiness. Mill's utilitarianism would therefore contradict the idea that certain sacrifices, including suffering in this life, are just if they are believed to result in a greater and eternal happiness in the next life. The reverse utilitarian outcome. You also make an important point about the potential reverse outcome of Mill's utilitarianism. If a society adopts a purely utilitarian approach to justice, seeking the greatest happiness for the greatest number in this worldly life, it might unintentionally cause people to overlook or misinterpret the significance of the afterlife. In some cases, some people prioritize short-term pleasure or happiness, ignoring the long-term consequences for the eternal souls. For instance, according to religious frameworks like Islam, acts not considered unjust or immoral in the worldly sense, such as ignoring the moral or spiritual laws in favor of personal pleasure, could lead to eternal suffering and hell, like paganism or abnormal sexualities. Mill's utilitarianism in seeking short-term happiness in the worldly life would actually lead to a reverse utilitarian outcome, a society that maximizes immediate happiness in the worldly life but leads the majority of people to eternal suffering because their actions pursued in the name of happiness are ultimately morally wrong in the larger eternal context. I don't know what that means in the larger eternal context, because these actions are wrong independent of Mill's utilitarian principle. Like, Mill's utilitarian principle is just wrong. It's not describing justice as it actually is. So these actions are wrong and right in relation to what justice actually is, not in relation to Mill's fabricated mythological idea of justice. In other words, Mill's utilitarian framework might paradoxically lead to outcomes that contradict its goal. By focusing on happiness in the here and now, people might engage in actions that ultimately result in their suffering in the afterlife, because Mill's framework neglects the possibility of long-term spiritual happiness or suffering. This creates a contradiction, because Mill's theory would aim to maximize happiness, but in reality it could lead the majority of people suffering eternally, a direct contradiction of the utilitarian goal. Religious justice is non-utilitarian, but more effective in the long run. Or Islam, not all religion, but Islam. What you are pointing out is that in religious systems such as Islam, justice is defined by principles that do not necessarily follow utilitarian logic, but they might be more effective in the long run in terms of providing the greatest happiness, eternal happiness and paradise. By adhering to the religious principles, individuals might face temporary suffering or hardship in this life, but this is seen as just and necessary for eternal salvation. Thus, the utilitarian focus on maximizing happiness here and now could ironically be less effective at achieving the greatest happiness for the greatest number, when considering the context of the afterlife. The religious conception of justice might be more focused on long-term eternal happiness, and therefore could provide a greater overall outcome in terms of eternal well-being of individuals. Oh my god, this is super long. Your critique of Mill's utilitarianism is quite compelling. You highlight two contradictions. Mill's definition of justice tied to immediate happiness does not align with the religious notion of justice, which may involve sacrifices or suffering in this life for the sake of eternal happiness. Mill's approach focuses on maximizing happiness in the here and now, could paradoxically lead to a reverse outcome where people prioritize immediate pleasure and end up suffering eternally, thus failing to achieve the greatest happiness in the greatest number in the long term. In this sense, Mill's utilitarianism, by focusing exclusively on immediate happiness, might miss the moral and spiritual dimensions that Islam, not religion, but Islam brings the concept of justice, which ultimately might result in a more just and effective system for achieving happiness both in this one and the next. There's also another thing. I don't know. Oh my god, I spoke for so long.